MRI is such a powerful method. I got into it because you could see biochemistry inside the living cell. For me, there was never a boundary. It's okay, biochemistry, zoology, and organic chemistry. I ended up training people in physics. It's all related. Both MRI and radio astronomy, they look at weak signals, and you see it in the person of Ed Purcell. He had unified NMR and radio astronomy. He did both. So he wins the Nobel Prize for NMR, but a year before that, he discovers the 21 centimeter line in the galaxy. So nobody can dispute that an NMR person can understand radio astronomy.
We hear you are something of an expert in analyzing the radio spectra from human beings. And you developed the world's first ultra-high field MRI. And we would love to hear your story about how you got into all of this.
Yes. All right. Yeah. It was a privilege to do it. I was very fortunate to be able to do that as a scientist.
So ultra-high fields MRI is functionally different from everything that came before it, or it's an improvement?
No, it's really an extension of it. So what happened was that we had MRI, and then there was a real question as to whether or not you could go to higher magnetic field strengths. So clinically, back in the mid-90s, a clinical scanner for humans might have been operating at 1.5 Tesla. Typically, there were 1.5 Tesla scanners. So 1 Tesla is 10,000 Gauss, and the Earth's magnetic field is about half a Gauss at sea level. So a 1.5 Tesla is about 15,000 Gauss. The push to ultra high field was really a push from beyond 4 Tesla, which was very high field. 4 Tesla would have been 40,000 Gauss, all the way up to 80,000 Gauss. That was the 8 Tesla. And what made it ultra high field is actually because of the frequency we're using. So the ultra high frequency spectrum starts above 300 megahertz. So we're in the ultra high frequency range. And so that's why I called it ultra high field MRI.
And so let's take a moment to orient our listeners who might not know much about MRI beyond the fact that it allows you to look into the human body.
Right.
What's actually happening?
Well, MRI theory is a little bit complicated, but what we're looking at in human imaging is typically the water line. So you have, as you know, the body is mostly made up of water, and 3/4 water or so, and water is 110 molar in protons. So in a water molecule, there are 2 protons, and so water is 55 molar. So you're about 110 molar in protons. So when we collect an MR image, we actually are looking usually at the water line. Now,
and when you say line, you're talking about the radio emissions, right?
Well, we excite the water line, and then we listen to it again. We excite the spins, and then we listen to the spins as they relax. So people call it a radio technique now because we're in that frequency range of the radio band. For instance, if you look at carbon at 9.4 Tesla, in a 9.4 Tesla magnet, if you look at carbon, it would be at 100 megahertz. So that's 100 on your FM dial, right? 100 megahertz. So that's why if you're doing carbon NMR, which would be carbon 13 in that case, you'd actually be sitting right at the frequency of your radio station downtown. So those scanners have to be well shielded. So if you're at 9.4 Tesla, you want to be well shielded from the radio station, so you can actually hear the weak signal that you're trying to detect, which is just a few microvolts. So they're very weak signals, so you have to be well shielded. So, but in proton NMR, in human imaging, most of what happens in radiology, that's done using the water line. And we also people who do MRI also can do spectroscopy, and they'll do phosphorus, and I did lots of work in phosphorus in spectroscopy of the heart in animal models.
And this is just listening to other bands than water?
Yeah, we're going to different nuclei. So phosphorus, sodium, potassium. Some people are looking at those nuclei. The more important ones, I think, are the proton and nitrogen, carbon. These are the sodium and potassium are important, but it's not commonly used. And then you can do imaging of the lungs using helium MR. I mean, and then there that requires polarization. That's a little more complicated, but the basic idea in getting an MRI image is, you place the person in a big magnetic field, and then you send a signal that when you place them in a magnetic field, what happens is the spins. So you have so the theory is a little complicated maybe for the podcast, but you have the hydrogen atom has a proton, and that proton will align with the field, either parallel or anti-parallel, with the magnetic field. It actually processes around the field like a top. And then in MR, we actually force a transition. We invert the population of the spins, and then we look at it as it relaxes back. But that's kind of complicated, but it has some importance, but maybe not for our podcast. But that's how it's done. You go in the scanner, and then when you're going into the scanner, for people who have had clinical MRI, you'll hear a lot of noise. You hear thumping and stuff in the scanner, and those are gradients that are going off. We excite the spins with radio frequency, but then we also are encoding the spin spatially so that we can get the image. We want to know where the signal is coming from, and that's done with gradients. So we put currents in these gradient coils that are inside the magnet, and these gradient coils then give us spatial information about where the spin is coming from. That's how we can get the image. So we get two things. We get the relaxation behavior of the spin. We can see how the water is going back to its equilibrium state after we excite it. And that depends on the type of tissue you have. And it can also depend on if you've got a tumor or something like that. That's why MRI is so important clinically. So the relaxation back to equilibrium, that's what we're looking at. And then we need to find out where that's coming from. So we encode the spins so that they tell us where they're coming from by using these gradients inside the scanner.
And when the atoms relax, they give off this light, this radio signal.
They give off a radio signal. It's very weak, but we actually can detect the radio signal. So inside the scanner, there's also coils, radio coils. They're basically antennas, radio antennas. That's why we could hear a carbon. We could, if you're at 9.4 Tesla, we very well can hear the FM station. So at 8 Tesla, the proton is at 340 megahertz. There's a little equation called the Lamar equation. It's not too complicated. It just tells you the frequency that you're going to be detecting is just equal to the gyromagnetic ratio. That's a constant times the strength of the field. So the larger the field, the higher the frequency. There's just a constant there, the gyromagnetic ratio. And then so you have mu equals gamma b. That's the equation. Mu equals gamma b. Now, mu is the frequency, gamma is the gyromagnetic ratio, and B naught is the magnetic field strength. And what the gradients do is, to the B naught term, they add little terms that cause the frequencies to be different at different places inside the magnet. So that's what gradients are doing.
And this is how you get that sort of depth of field. That's how you see what's happening inside the body.
Yeah, that's how we see what's happening inside. So an MRI scanner, there are three major components, I guess. There's the magnet itself. Then there's the gradient insert. There's gradients that are it's like a tube that goes inside the magnet. And then inside that, again, then there's coils that are antennas to listen to excite the spins. We want to excite them, and then we want to listen to them again. So those are the three big components: the magnet, the gradient, and the receiver coils or the transmit coils.
And how is it that listening to the water inside of a body can tell you information about the pathology of that body?
Yeah, because, well, there are two properties of water called, now you get into NMR theory a little bit, they're called T1 and T2 relaxation. So once we take the spins and we excite them, they actually enter, they're normally precessing along the z-axis. The z-axis is lined up with the magnetic field, and they precess like a top around the z-axis, and then we nutate them away from that axis and put them in the xy plane. And when they're in the xy plane, they want to do two things. One of the first thing they want to do is dephase with one another. That's called T2 relaxation. And the second thing they want to do is they want to go back to equilibrium. So they have T1 relaxation, and that's also it's a very important T1 relaxation because it's a thermal process that relaxes the spin. It requires an interaction with the lattice that the spin is finding itself in.
But so how is it?
MRI has a lot of physics associated with it. Most people don't realize. Like, I used to teach graduate students in physics, used to come and take my course in MRI, but they were getting PhDs in physics, but they still took graduate classes in MRI because there's a lot of physics in MRI.
And I want to get to the sort of the story of all of the physics that went into the development of the MRI, the entire history. But before we do, I have sort of this, I think that it's a conceptual question. How is it that by looking at the water in the body, which is pretty much everywhere in the body, why does it tell you about something being wrong?
Yeah. So what happens is that, so there's these two processes. I started to tell you, and then I kind of lost my train of thought, I guess. So there's two processes, T1 and T2 relaxation. And so what happens is you excite the spins, and in normal tissue, we know the rate at which this, there's a rate at which the relaxation will take place back to equilibrium.
It's the baseline.
And what happens is that in cancer, the rates are different.
Do you know why?
Discovered that in 1971. He published a paper in Science where he said that the relaxation properties between tumorous tissue and normal tissue were different. And that was the big, one of the big pushes, or people recognized that this would be very important to study in the human being, that you might be able to diagnose tumors non-invasively. And of course, that's what happened. MRI became an extremely powerful means of looking at not only at tumors, but now people that do MRI do all kinds of things, diffusion weighted imaging. I mean, there's all the functional imaging where the person can be given images and they're looking at images, and then that activates their visual cortex in the back of their head, their occipital lobe, and then so then you.
It's a hugely important.
See differences in flow, in blood flow in those regions, in small vessels, very small vessels.
So you can see everything from compositional changes to structural integrity changes.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things. MRI is such a powerful method. I mean, I got into it because you could see biochemistry inside the living cell. And so when I was a graduate student in the early 80s, people at Oxford and were doing biochemistry on living cells, in England. And a few groups in the US were starting to do that. Bob Schulman at Yale, there were several, and they were looking at living cells. And I was thinking, wow, this is really the way to go. And that's how I got in independently, by the way. I was doing my PhD at Iowa State, and people there weren't really interested in looking at biochemistry using NMR in the living cell, but I thought it was just the future to see biochemistry non-invasively. And like, for instance, in the heart, I mean, you could see all kinds of biochemical changes if the heart's under ischemia, if it has ischemic injury, or if it goes into heart failure. There's all kinds of biochemistry that goes on. You could sample it with NMR. And you could also, like, for instance, I used to do work on monitoring what happens in the TCA cycle. How does your heart, what does it eat in response to work? Like, if you take a heart and you make it work, what happens to it? And what happens is the heart is, when it's at low rate pressure products, it's not working too hard. It kind of will eat anything. It's not too fussy. But this is true in animals. And then when you go up in rate pressure products, what happens is the heart gets very selective, and then it wants fats, and we saw this where it's turning off some metabolites and turning on others as a function of work. So these are things that you can only really do with NMR, to look at rate pressure product changes in a living organism, and how is the heart, like the rates of like I discovered that the rate of creatine kinase, which is an enzyme inside the heart, changes from the outside of the heart to the inside of the heart. There's actually a change in the rate at which the enzyme was happening in animal models. So you see a lot of things about about biochemistry in the living organ, and it's not dissected.
It's like you can view the dynamics spatially all of a sudden.
Right. You view the dynamics spatially, and so there's always been continuous pushes especially in phosphorus NMR and proton NMR, because in addition to water, there's other metabolites, right? In your brain, you have N-acetyl-aspartate, creatine, choline, all these things, and you can actually get signals from these things and make maps of the brain as to what's your N-acetyl-aspartate distribution.
Cycling proteins, basically.
It's an enormous field, and there's people. The creativity of NMR scientists, of MRI scientists, is pretty amazing. Some of the things that I've seen happen in the last 30 years, it's really phenomenal what can be done now with MRI. So
that actually led to you pursuing 2 different PhDs, if I recall correctly.
Yes. So I did my graduate school at Iowa State University, and I actually started working with David Metzler, who was a very well-known biochemist. He had worked on the mechanism of action of vitamin B6, and he had written an important textbook on biochemistry, which was used in many very good graduate schools. Most people often, especially medical students, they learn from Leninger. It's a common book, or Stryer. But Metzler was a book that was well known because it really focused on mechanisms of action, and he cared about, when in vitamin B6, how the substrate, how the electrons are flowing in these reactions and so on. So it was a very, very detailed faculty member, and I did my master's with him, and then I defended my master's, and I had basically done all my work for a PhD in biochemistry. Coursework. I was done my coursework, and then but then he gave me a project, and unfortunately David's deceased now, but he was a good man. But he gave me a project where he wanted me to measure a pKa, which is a dissociation constant for a proton, deep inside the active site of an enzyme called aspartate aminotransferase, which is important in the heart. And we used to isolate this enzyme from the pig heart, and we go to the slaughterhouse and get 200 pig hearts, and then get this enzyme. And then David was involved in crystallizing the enzyme, getting the X-ray diffraction for that enzyme. And then, so that enzyme, which is quite important in your heart, it binds vitamin B6. And David wanted to know, well, what's the pKa of the amino acid down here that's helping to bind this vitamin B6? And I told him, I said, Dave, nobody cares. If I do a PhD on this, and I'll give you the answer, there's only a few people in the world who will care. You're one of them. And I told them, well, now people are doing biochemistry in vivo with NMR at Oxford. We should do in vivo biochemistry. And Dave was against it. And I said, well, okay, well, then I'm leaving. I'm not going to do a PhD to measure that pKa.
Wow.
And then I went to a electron microscopist, George Brown in zoology. He was an electron microscopist, and he had a beautiful model of sperm cells from Limulus polyphemus. And these sperm cells, when they get, so this is a horseshoe crab, and what happens is the female lays the eggs, and then the eggs release a protein in the sea, and then when the male comes, the protein binds to the sperm of the male, and the sperm swim towards the area of increased concentration. That's how they find the egg in the ocean. So by using this peptide, which you can get from a female, and you can add it to the spermatozoa, you can actually make the spermatozoa swim. So it was just a beautiful model to study bioenergetics inside the sperm cell in a very well controlled setting. So, I told him, I said, well, George, we can do NMR on these cells, and he goes, what's NMR? What do I want to do that for? And because, like I said, he was an electron microscopist, he was very open-minded, and so he took me in as a zoology graduate student. Now, of course, I didn't have any money, so he didn't have any money either. So what I did was I went to the dean of the graduate school and I said, can you give me a stipend to do work in zoology, do an NMR? And it was, graduate students don't do that. You don't go to the dean and ask for money. So anyhow, I did. And he said, well, Pierre, why don't you write me a proposal and we'll see what I can do. So I wrote him a proposal and he funded me for 2 years to do work. So I got an RA, and in that department in zoology, nobody had an RA. It was very rare to be on an RA. Most people were teaching. They had TAs, they were teaching assistants, but I got a research assistantship directly from the vice president.
And that's very different from today.
And then the whole thing is now I was doing zoology and it's fine. It's a very interesting science, but I never wanted to be a zoologist. I wanted to be a biochemist. So when I took my master's exam, there was an inorganic chemist, a bioinorganic chemist on the committee, and his name was Don Kurtz. And he ended up becoming a chair of chemistry. I can't remember where it was, Austin, I think, but it was somewhere down south. But anyhow, Don was a very nice guy, and he had served on my master's committee. And I said, Don, would you permit me to do a PhD in inorganic chemistry as well as zoology? Can I double major? And he said, well, Pierre, nobody double majors. You're crazy.
She's like, you can, but I don't know.
But that was the way to become a biochemist. So what I did was, so Don said, well, Pierre, I'm interested in these supunculate worms. So there's these worms also in the ocean. They're called supunculate worms. And these worms, instead of having hemoglobin, inside their red blood cells, they have an unusual protein called hemerythrin. It has 2 irons on it. It binds the iron and the oxygen end on the two against the 2 iron atoms. And he wanted to know, biochemists know that in human cells, there's an effector of oxygen binding called 2,3-DPG. And that affects how the human hemoglobin binds oxygen. And he wanted to know if this happened in the supunculate worm. So what I did was, he said, Pierre, if you can get me a phosphorus spectrum of the supunculate worm red blood cell, I'll take you on your graduate student. So I ordered some worms and cut them up, took the red blood cells, and then put them in an NMR tube. And I pulsed the scanner at phosphorus, and I got this huge pre-induction decay, a huge signal. And Fourier transformed it, which is just a mathematical manipulation. And then I got all these phosphorus peaks in there, and I talked to him, and he goes, what are these? And I said, I don't know yet. Okay, I'll take you on as a student. And in those red blood cells, I found a compound, 2-aminoethyl phosphonate, and that acted in the supunculate like 2,3-DPG in the red blood cell. So for the bioinorganic part of that PhD, I had to take the hemerythrin, purify it, and then add. I had a device where I can add a very small aliquot of oxygen to it and measure the absorption of the hemerythrin, and then you could actually measure what happened in terms of the oxygen affinity for the protein with and without 2-AEP, and then we were able to see that, okay, this is an effector of hemerythrin. So for the craziness about this double major is, I kind of had like 2 separate committees. I had the zoology part working on sperm cells, and then the other part, and then I had to take the preliminary exams for inorganic chemistry. So when I joined zoology, I immediately started taking inorganic chemistry classes.
That's
and
amazing.
In the end, I finished the whole thing with a double major in 4 years. That's my master's and my PhD.
Wow.
So I worked like a dog. I was always in the scanner room collecting spectra. And I owe a lot to these 2 people, George Brown and Don Kurtz. I mean, they were just wonderful
Well, they believed that you could do
Open
it, something that
mind.
was kind of, they believed that you could do something that was well outside the scope of what was being done around you, right? A double
Right.
major.
There was nothing like that being done at Iowa State. It's a very, very good university. Actually, Gilman, which is the father of American inorganic chemistry, was at Iowa State, and the chemistry building, inorganic chemistry at Iowa State, is a very good place to study inorganic chemistry, by the way. And anyhow, it's a great university. You know, we have a lot of good universities in America, and people sometimes we talk about the Harvards or whatever, but there's good things going on at other places that you don't hear the names so much. But Iowa
It
State,
sounds like a student at one of these schools would have a little bit more ability to pick and choose. Because if you go to a place like Harvard and you tell your boss that you don't want to do what they want you to do, they might be less amenable than they are at a school where, you
well,
know,
I did have to leave biochemistry, right? I did have to leave,
that's true.
and it was unfortunate. I now it's an interesting thing about Dave Metzler because, well, there's a very, very good MRI scientist called Camille Ugerville. He's at the University of Minnesota. He's one of the world leaders. And when Camille had come to give a talk in biochemistry, and he was a young faculty member at the time, and he came to give a talk in biochemistry, and the host was David Metzler. But now by then I had left, I was in zoology, but I knew Camille. I really wanted to meet this guy. So I went to David and I said, you know, David, Camille Ugerville is coming here to give a talk, and I'd really like to meet him. He says, well, you know, Pierre, somebody's supposed to take him out to dinner, and nobody's being available to take him out. Now, I just can't believe that I got able to go out to dinner with Camille Ugerville because, I mean, really, professors should have taken him out to dinner. I mean, he's a very, very distinguished scientist, even before he came to even before he came to Iowa State. I mean, I think he had given lectures at the Nobel conferences where they give the Nobel Prize and stuff. I mean, this guy is Camille Ugerville is just a fantastic scientist. So I said I got to go to lunch. I got to go to take Camille out to dinner, and then so then my career, how it developed after that is Camille. I worked at the University of Minnesota. He had come. He had worked for Bob Schulman. I think that was at Yale. I can't remember where Bob was now. But so Camille had come to Minnesota, and he had a very active program doing cardiac spectroscopy, which I would see. He had good interactions with both people in cardiology and people in surgery. And so I called him up when I got close to being done with PhD. I called him up. I said, Camille, do you have a postdoc for me? And he remembered me, and he said, well, I just gave my last one away. And then he talked to cardiology, and then cardiology funded me to go up. So I got to go. And the other guy who he had just given the postdoc to was Michael Garwood, which if you look up Michael Garwood, he's an excellent scientist as well. So you know, Mike went on to a distinguished career with Camille, and then I came there, and then kind of Mike was a theoretician, and I did more spectroscopy first on rat hearts and then other animal models. And so
is during your postdoc where you started building things for the first time? When did you actually start on the engineering side?
Yeah, that's where I started getting some understanding of the engineering of MR. But then I was not, well, I was thinking, well, maybe I should just leave science. I never thought it was good enough to be a professor right away. So I wanted to, maybe I should just leave science. And after 2 years, I told Camille, well, after a year and a half, I told him I was going to go apply to medical school and go to medicine. So he wrote me a letter, and I got accepted to medical school. But then after I got accepted, he said, well, Pierre, can you stay here and be a postdoc for another year, a third year of postdoc? And he really did need me. I mean, he had so much work to do, and he had an NIH grant and stuff. And I said, okay, fine, Camille, I'll do it. And he said, you know, Pierre, you really shouldn't go and be a physician. You should become a scientist. Go be a professor. You're too good to be a physician. Well, that's what he said. I mean, I'm not saying it had never occurred to me to become a faculty member. I never thought I was good enough. And so
What did you plan to do? I mean, I guess you
planned
to
go to medical school, and then, my dad had been a physician, so I was, okay, I got his PhD. Now it was interesting. I'll go to medical school because I'm really not good enough to be a faculty member.
Yeah.
But in the end, I ended up having a beautiful career.
Well, that's kind of how these things go, right? Where doors open and you meet people and they depend on you and they push you in these directions. And then you look back and you realize that it was instrumental to everything that you had done, these sorts of small pushes.
Yeah, it's a bunch of small pushes. I mean, even as an undergraduate, I took physics course. I was a general science major, so how did I end up doing this? But I was a general science major, but I loved taking the harder courses. So I took modern physics and calculus-based physics in the sophomore level modern physics course, where we learn about thermal radiation, black body radiation. So my life was it was kind of interesting that things kind of moved me towards where I would.
Yeah.
And one of the things is I also always had an interest in all of science. So just the way I was trained, for me, there was never a boundary. It's okay, biochemistry, zoology, inorganic chemistry. I ended up training people in physics, like I said. So it's all related. And NMR is a very nuclear magnetic resonance, which is the sister technique of MRI. It's very there's a lot of physics in it. So
yeah. So hold on. Can we trace this line between NMR and MRI? Because at the culmination of the story is that you direct the assembly and development of the first 8 Tesla MRI. But you start by doing NMR of these spermatozoa. And so what was the sort of the progression there?
So then when I went to Minnesota, then I was doing work on the heart, and the work was very well received. I mean, Camille was he's a very intelligent man, and he had very focused science, and he taught me a lot. And when I would go to conferences, I mean, Camille was Camille's group, our group at the time was always competing. His abstracts would be against what's going on at Oxford and what's going on at Harvard in the heart, right? So there were people in those places, George Rada at Harvard and at Oxford, and Joanne Ingwall at Harvard. They were working on the heart, and I would submit abstracts. My abstracts would always be next to people that were at Harvard or Oxford. So when I got done my PhD, Camille said, well, on my postdoc, Camille said, well, why don't you become a professor? I said, I'll never get a job. And he said, well, why don't you apply? So I sent out some letters, and that fall, which was the fall of '88, I was receiving so many offers to visit universities. I was going somewhere almost every week. So the funny one, now we're digressing a little bit, but I never told this story. So the first one was at the University of Chicago. So I sent a letter, and the chair of radiology at the University of Chicago calls me back and says, Pierre, we want you to come and interview. And I didn't even have any slides. He said, I want you to be here. I can't remember, like it was in 2 days. We'll send you a ticket and come on and see the Department of Radiology at the University of Chicago. So I didn't even have any slides. Like, well, can you what? I have to work on my talk. So I hurried up, got some slides done quick, and I rushed them through, and then flew to Chicago. I had never really traveled too much, it might have been one of my first plane rides. And so I flew from Minnesota to O'Hare. And when I got there, a limousine picked me up and they brought me downtown.
A limousine?
Beautiful hotel room, right in front of the water tower. And when I walked into my room, it said Suite 500. And I'll always remember this place because it had like 7 telephones and 3 bathrooms. It was just unbelievable. Oh my gosh, this is the big time. I'm not ready for this. So what I did is I called the bellboy and I said, do you mind listening to my talk? He listened to my talk, and as I practiced my talk that I would give at the University of Chicago the next day. And then, of course, they wanted to make me an offer. And then after that, I had many other places where I interviewed. And at one of the places was the first 4T in the world. So now I had worked on an animal scanner. It was 4.7 Tesla, but it was doing animal research for heart. And then the world's first 4 Tesla scanner was about to come to the University of Alabama. And there was
And what year is this?
Pardon?
What year is this?
This is going to be this is 88 when I'm discussing this. So what happens is that so I'm supposed to go to the University of Alabama. They call me up and they say, Pierre, we want you to come and interview here for a job. And so the person was Jerry Povos. He was a cardiologist who had trained at MGH, and he was very, very respected in MRI. And a good guy. So Jerry called me up to go to Alabama to work on the world's first 4 Tesla project, human 4 Tesla. And the magnet was actually being prepared. It was at Philips in Hamburg, in Germany. So he said, well, you need to go to Hamburg and go look at the Philips magnet and what they're building for us at the Alabama. So he flew me out to Hamburg. And then when I got there, I met with the engineers and stuff. And I came to understand what they were going to do for this 4 Tesla. Now, I wasn't going to be in charge of it. That was going to be given to Jan den Hollander, who's a more senior person. He had worked like Dr. Ugabel with Bob Schulman. And so Jan den Hollander was going to be in charge, and they wanted a person who was going to be daily on the magnet kind of thing. So anyhow, so I went to Hamburg, and that was quite interesting. When I got back, Jerry, Dr. Povos, I think he was the personal cardiologist of the King of Morocco. So one day he calls me up.
Did you say the King of Morocco?
No, what? Did I meet the King of Morocco?
No, did you just say King of Morocco?
Yeah.
Okay, he was the personal cardiologist of the
King of Morocco. So one day he calls me up. He says, Pierre, do you want to come to Morocco? I have to go get a physical exam as a king. I really can't. But my wife's pregnant right now. I've got all these interviews. So anyhow, so the long and the short of it is.
So you were one step away, one plane ride away from royalty, is what you're saying.
So I ended up not going to Morocco and not going to Alabama. And the way that happened was, and that job ended up being taken by a very good young scientist, Hobie Hetherington. He took that job and he did great with it. So Hobie went to Alabama, and then what happened to me is I had applied to Ohio State as one of these letters, but they never got back to me. And then all of a sudden, I think it's like in December, they call me up and they say, well, we want you to come and interview at Ohio State. I'm like, well, I've got this job offer at Alabama. It's the world's first 4 Tesla magnet. You guys don't even have anything at Ohio State. You only have a 1.5 clinical magnet.
You don't even have a Tesla. Yeah.
Okay? So they didn't really have much. And Gabriel said, well, Pierre, you're not going to give up a 4 Tesla to go work at Ohio State. Well, so I went to Ohio State and I gave the talk, and there was something very different about Ohio State. So every other place I went to, I would meet the chair of the department and professors in that department. But when I went out to Ohio State, it was completely different. I met vice presidents. I met Art James, the head of the cancer hospital is named after Dr. James today, the James Cancer Hospital at Ohio State. So I got to meet Art James. I got to meet the deans and the associate deans and the vice president for research. I was meeting all these people. I'm like, what is going on? So I knew it was different. So then the chair of the department, he says, well, would you like to come to Ohio State? I said, well, we don't have anything at Ohio State. And he said, well, just write me a letter and tell me what you want. So I write them this impossible letter of like requesting, okay, these are the things that I want. And, it was in the moon, buy me a 4.7 Tesla magnet. This was well over $1 million I'm asking for as a startup, young assistant professor. I was 28 years old. And, so I had a whole bunch of points, and so they met. I went and gave the talk, and then I know of the date. It was December 28th. All the deans met with the chair of the department, and then I got a letter back from the chairman of radiology that said we agree to all your points. So once they agreed, you can't say, well, I'm not coming. So in the meantime, I had told Jerry Povos at Alabama that he would hear by January 1st because he kept waiting for me to make my decision. And he even flew my wife down to Alabama to try to, just by herself, to try to get her to Birmingham and please come to Alabama. But and that would have been quite nice because I would have lived in Hamburg for a year, and then after living in Hamburg, then I would have gone to Alabama and done the 4T project. And I don't know if Hobie ever did that. I think he must have gone to Hamburg as well. So anyhow, I ended up staying at Ohio State, and they had given me this amazing deal for an assistant professor. So when I went there, I thought, well, I'm an assistant professor. Well, okay, that's great at a Big Ten university. That's pretty fantastic. And then they gave me a secretary, and then I write my first letter, and the secretary says, well, what are you? And I said, well, I'm an assistant professor of radiology. And she goes, no, you're not an assistant professor of radiology. So she goes up to the chairman, and he tells her, he says, no, he's the director of MRI research. He's not just a professor of radiology. So they put me in the whole research division. So I was 28, and probably in hindsight, that was a lot of responsibility for me, because I probably didn't have you can be a great scientist, but and I'm not saying I was a great scientist, but even if you are a great scientist, it doesn't mean you're a good administrator. Those are two different things, and people skills involved, you make mistakes, and that's okay. That's part of you. So
yeah, you learn over time. But
and the other thing is, and this is important for a Tesla, is that Dr. Zavoisky, which was the dean, when I got hired at OSU, I told him, I said, well, Dr. Zavoisky, I'm giving up a 4 Tesla magnet if I come to OSU. A 4 Tesla human magnet. And Dr. Zavoisky said, well, Pierre, if 4 Tesla ever makes it in medical imaging, we'll buy you one. So that was that promise that Dr. Zavoisky made. He didn't say, I promise. He just said, we'll get you one. And later on, that became the incentive to getting us an 8 Tesla, because I went to Dr. Zavoisky one day and I said, well, Dr. Zavoisky, 4 Tesla is making it. And he said, well, let's have a committee and discuss what we should do. So he ended up putting Dr. Mazzaferri, who was the head of internal medicine, in this committee to examine the problem of should OSU invest in 4 Tesla technology and where to get the money. So they were able to get money from the main hospital, the cancer hospital, many groups, the vice president for research. OSU was unusual because they had one of the first 1.5 Teslas in the world from GE. And there was a professor there called Dr. William Hunter. And Bill he was the director of research before I was, and he had a relationship with Technicare, which was in Northern Ohio. And OSU had signed a contract with Technicare. I think they had signed a contract. They were getting a Technicare scanner. And then Bill reversed it and awarded the contract to General Electric. So instead of getting like a 0.5 Tesla Technicare, I don't know what the field strength was, but it was less than 1.5. They got a 1.5 Tesla GE scanner, and that came to OSU. And that was the first MRI that came to the university. But it came before FDA approval. So it was bought for research, but then, so the dean bought it so that they could do research with the scanner, but then it got FDA approval. And now so many patients wanted to get into it that now it was moved from the research group to the clinical group. And then the research group lost out on all this potential source of revenue of, from their MRI scanner.
Sure.
And so that's one of the incentives of why why they were open, the hospitals were open to giving money to fund ultra-high field. So when they agreed to this, they found the money. I went to Dr. Zavoisky and he said, well, Pierre, we have enough money to get you a 14. And it was about $1 million per Tesla. That was the rule. It's about $1 million per Tesla.
Wow. And
then I said, well, Dr. Zavoisky, if you give me this money, can I get a higher field magnet for the same amount of capital? Can I get a higher field magnet? He says, Pierre, get whatever you want. You can decide, and this is how much money you have, and you can get a higher field magnet. So that's kind of.
And that hadn't been built yet.
Pardon?
The higher field magnet hadn't been built yet. Is the
That's
subtext
right.
there?
But you had the sense that you would be able to do it cheaper than market rate?
Yes.
And where did that come from? Where did that come from? Because
I had figured out that a magnet would. So okay, so now we have to go back a little fast, but because we're a little skipping the history of MRI itself, and we're doing
so this is something that I wanted to get to. So the point that I'm really curious about is that you go from NMR to MRI so smoothly, but that's not necessarily, that might not be clear for everyone who's listening. So can you draw the
Right.
sort of the historical lines, cover Damadian, tell us
Yes,
about the past here?
we could start maybe with a little history of MRI. So, really, and MRI history is like filled with controversy. The first process is really electron paramagnetic resonance, and that was actually that was discovered by Zavoisky at Kazan University in the Soviet Union in 1944. Now, before that, in 41, apparently he had seen an NMR signal, which is looking at the nucleus, but then he had trouble with it. The field was not homogeneous enough, and so on. So he moved to the electron, and the gyromagnetic ratio of the electron is much higher. So in a sense, it was an easier experiment to do. And he was the first one to see the resonance process in the electron in 1944. And then a year later, now, of course, he published this.
Is the basic idea, just real quick for everybody, the basic idea is sort of manipulating the spin of the electron?
Yeah.
And getting light out of it as a result?
Electron. And he had done it in copper, in manganese, I think. They have an unpaired electron, and so he had manipulated that spin. And then after that,
you get a radio signal out of it too. Is that correct?
Yes, a higher frequency signal for a given magnetic field strength. You'll get a higher frequency. So typically, EPR, it's a sister technique of NMR. So these techniques are all related: electron paramagnetic resonance, nuclear magnetic resonance, and MRI. There's a lot of common physics to all of this. Okay, so what happened is,
and the commonality, sorry, before you go into this, the commonality is that you take a substance and you excite it, and you're able to read the emission spectrum after you've excited it.
Yeah, so you take, provided the substance has spin. So for instance, you can't do an MR on carbon-12 because carbon-12 doesn't have a net spin.
It's too stable.
You have to have carbon-13. So you have to have an unpaired neutron, for instance. If you look at how the neutrons and protons pair up in the nucleus of carbon, you'll see that you end up with an unpaired neutron. And so in carbon, you have a spin 1/2. It's a spin 1/2 nucleus, carbon-13.
So you need like an asymmetry. You need an asymmetry in the molecule in order to be able to see it move. Otherwise, it's basically like a featureless thing that's spinning that you can't.
You need a quantum mechanical asymmetry. It's more complicated than just asymmetry, but there's a quantum mechanical asymmetry in the nucleus.
Okay.
Or for the electron, you have an unpaired electron. So the nuclei that NMR people can look at are all the nuclei that have an unpaired or one or more unpaired protons or neutrons. So you could have, like, for instance, deuterium, which is a proton and a neutron. You have an unpaired proton and an unpaired neutron. The total spin for that is 1, and you can actually do deuterium NMR. And tritium has 2 protons and 2 neutrons and 1 proton. Tritium, 2 neutrons and 1 proton. The two neutrons are paired, so it's a spin 1/2 nucleus. So
did the EPR discovery draw a lot of attention at the time?
No, it was kind of, I mean, within the Soviet Union, it probably got some attention. And Zavoisky ended up going to Moscow and building an EPR machine in Moscow and proving to them that, EPR does work. But interestingly, he never won the Nobel Prize for this, right? So there are 3 great figures at the beginning of NMR of this. There's Zavoisky, who did the electron, and then there's 2 people in the United States. One of them is Felix Bloch, who was of Swiss origin. And Bloch had worked, I mean, he was the first graduate student of Heisenberg, of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And then he had also worked with Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, and Pauli. So eventually, Felix Bloch was born in Switzerland, and then he eventually came to the United States and settled at Stanford. And then he was involved in Los Alamos during the Second World War. He didn't like it apparently, and then he ended up going to Harvard briefly, where they were working on radar. They had a radar development group there, and he briefly went there. And in that same group, probably, that's where Ed Purcell was. So radar, microwave, this was microwave radar. Ed Purcell was working on microwave radar with Torrey and Pound at Harvard. So the Nobel Prize for NMR ends up going to Bloch and Purcell. And the key equations in NMR are called the Bloch equations. Still to this day, we use them. We use those equations in NMR. We use them in MRI. Okay, so Bloch and Purcell, they go together. Now, the interesting thing about Felix Bloch, he recognized that NMR was a thermal process, and we'll talk about that maybe at another time. But he talked about MRI being a thermal process, and so that's important because my career, of course, took me away from MRI eventually into astronomy. People just wonder, well, how did he ever get there? It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, yeah, what's really fascinating already is that you see a crosstalk between engineers who are working on, I mean, were these guys even aware that these were going to have medical applications? It seems like they're working on radar, right? But this technology, the knowledge applies both ways.
Yeah, they were going to do physics with it and chemistry, right? Mm-hmm. So most people who take organic chemistry, they learn a little bit about NMR spectroscopy for their organic exams.
For characterizing compounds. I mean, that's basically what it was invented for, right?
And with NMR, in solution NMR, you can take proteins and you can measure distances between atoms inside proteins. It's very important for 3D characterization. So Nobel Prizes have been given for that as well. But of these three people, Zavoisky, Bloch, and Purcell, all of them were interested in radar type technology, right? Mm-hmm. And Purcell had worked on radar during the Second World War. He worked on microwave development during the Second World War. So what did he do? So he wins the Nobel Prize for NMR, but a year before that, he discovers the 21 centimeter line in the galaxy. So he builds a horn, and this shows you how close NMR is to radio astronomy. And most people don't realize how close it is, but we have all the same equipment after the antenna. Our sample is different, but, we have preamplifiers and amplifiers.
And the basic idea is that you're listening for this radio signal that's being emitted from your sample at the end of the day.
And not only listening for the radio signal.
Yeah. So the MRI signal, we control it, but it's not a powerful signal, especially if you're looking at solution NMR. It's not necessarily a powerful signal. Not everything is 110 molar, right? Things in the cell are millimolar or less. So, you like ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is about 10 millimolar in the cell. So you don't have a lot of these compounds. So these are weak signals, right?
And you have to try to reconstruct what the signal actually is coming from. And that's kind of a similarity as well, right?
Both MRI and radio astronomy, they look at weak signals, and the engineering part of the receive part has a lot of similarities. So, and that's why you see it in the person of Ed Purcell. He had unified in his person NMR and radio astronomy. He did both, and he discovered the 21 centimeter line just a year before he won the Nobel Prize for NMR. So nobody can dispute that an NMR person can understand radio astronomy. I mean, that's
the 21 centimeter line is probably worth a Nobel Prize by itself.
I just let that go, because people who understand NMR, they can see why is it that an imaging person is interested in imaging in radio astronomy, or questions that you'd never think this guy should ever be doing this stuff. That's okay. People who understand the science, they can see the link, especially if they have good formation and that they understand that NMR is a thermal process and stuff. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody can see it, but I think some of the better scientists, they understand the link. So I don't worry about that when I get attacked for not being an astronomer. It doesn't bother me the slightest. Mm-hmm.
So who really decided to start pointing these things at human beings?
Or actually, let's start with animals, because it started with animals first, right? So you went from NMR of proteins and looking at binding interactions, and then
there was kind of a drive towards humans almost right away.
Huh.
I think people were looking at isolated cells, for instance, red blood cells, human red blood cells. At Oxford, people had, I think, 73, 76, kind of in those years, people had looked at human red blood cells. And Raymond Damadian, who had proposed in 1969, he proposed that we should use NMR to build an NMR scanner for humans. He wanted to put humans in the scanner. And the people, I mean, so the story gets, there gets to be a little controversy here, right? Because Raymond, he ended up writing a paper, I think it was in 73, where he, no, it was in 71, where he first demonstrated that tumors will have different relaxation times. And that was extremely important. That was published in Science.
And this was theoretical, though, right?
No, that was experimental.
This is experimental. So he was looking with NMR at tumor cells versus healthy cells?
Yeah, he was a physician. He was looking at tumor samples and regular samples, and he was saying that the relaxation properties are different here. And he managed to publish this in Science. And that was part of the incentive for people like Paul Lauterbur, who won, and I knew Paul well. I met all these people, Raymond Damadian and Paul Lauterbur and Peter Mansfield, mostly Paul Lauterbur, and I did meet Raymond pretty extensively, actually, Raymond Damadian. I mean, Raymond Damadian, he's an interesting character. I mean, he was a physician. He wanted to bring this to medicine, and he built a magnet. And that magnet is today, it's at the Smithsonian Institution, but as the first MRI scanner for humans. But he never really got a good image from the human. And but he did measure the T1s and T2s. I mean, he made a fundamental discovery here, which was very important. So when the Nobel Prize came, it actually didn't go to Raymond. It went to Paul Lauterbur and Peter Mansfield. And there's some speculation as to why Raymond never got the Nobel Prize. And of course, you have to remember now, to win the Nobel Prize, you have to have friends. So people have to nominate you, right? And some people know Raymond maybe didn't have too many friends. I mean, I don't have too many friends in science. If you're, sometimes it's like, if you're going to make an omelet, you're going to break some eggs, and maybe you'll have a lot of enemies. It's really irrelevant. Life is so short. I'm already 61, and life is so short. If you're so focused, it's like I always say, right? If you're an assistant professor, you're worried about getting tenure. You want to get tenure. You want to become an associate professor. So you don't want to rock the boat, right? So you got to worry about becoming an associate. And then if you're an associate, well, then you want to become a full professor. So you're not going to rock the boat again because you want to get your grants and become a full professor. And then once you're a full professor, well, now you got a lot of grants and you got a big group and you don't want to lose all that. And maybe you'll become a distinguished professor. So it just never ends. You could spend your whole life just fighting for more money and more grants and always not quite doing what's in your heart. So that's a danger of academia, that a lot of people don't realize the pressure that professors are under to get to the next level, and they get bigger and bigger groups, and they have to manage these groups. And I've been thankfully delivered from all that. I mean, it's important, and that's the way science functions. But if you're really going to change science, you can't worry about these things. You have to just look. You're going to do it, and whether people like you or hate you, it's irrelevant. You just write your papers, give your ideas. And there's a thing about human ideas, once you put an idea in a person's mind, like I've said, the sun is condensed matter, right? Well, at first people, they'll have that effect. There's a Semmelweis effect, right? And the Semmelweis reaction is, you don't believe it. It's an attack on the paradigm shift. It's on the paradigm, and so there's a shift, and it's attacking your dogma. And so there's actually a Semmelweis effect.
And the Semmelweis effect is named for Ignaz Semmelweis, who was the Hungarian physician who recommended hand washing as a way to prevent, I think it was women from dying in childbirth, right?
Right.
And so he was basically
he was
laughed
railroaded
at.
for it.
Yeah, he was railroaded by his colleagues.
He was the father of, and I've dedicated a talk to Semmelweis. He was the father of sanitary technique. So what physicians used to do is they used to go from the necropsy lab, they're dissecting bodies, right? And then they go from there to delivering a child. So what happens is now they bring disease, they bring bacteria
It's
from
horrifying.
the cadaver to the woman, and then she dies. So this was called childbed fever back in those days.
And people didn't want to hear that.
And well, what happened was Semmelweis realized that maybe there's a problem here because the midwives, so patients got to be scared to go to the physicians because they were dying there, but they weren't dying with the midwives. So because the midwives, of course, weren't doing autopsies, right?
Mm.
So anyhow, Semmelweis was quite astute. I think within 3 years he figured out that, hey, maybe we should wash our hands and sterilize our instruments and all that. And then he got the mortality rate to drop in the hospital. But then, he was thrown out. I think it was Vienna at first, and then he was thrown out, and then I think he went to Budapest. And then anyhow, so that hospital also had problems with childbirth fever and childbed fever. So eventually he gets sent to an asylum by his colleagues, and he dies in an insane asylum. And he is the father of sanitary methods in medicine. I mean, that's why people wash their hands and wear masks. It's because of Semmelweis, and he died beaten by his guards. After being beaten by his guards.
Why do you think people are so reluctant to consider the idea?
Right, and they felt insulted. Apparently, Semmelweis was quite hard on them.
I see.
And this comes back to the idea of needing to have friends, because we talk about this all the time, me and Mickey, where it seems like ideas require an enormous amount of politics to some degree, because
it depends which path you want to take.
Right. Do you want the Nobel, or is it just the idea that's important? And I think that Damadian really struggled with this, right? Because he wrote up articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post about the fact that he was wronged by the Nobel Committee for not having gotten, because it's incredibly unusual to not win the Nobel Prize when you are the discoverer of an effect.
Or a technology at this scale.
Especially the Nobel Prize, it could go to up to 3 people, right? But they chose to give it only to Paul Lauterbur and Peter Mansfield, and Raymond didn't get it.
I mean, that's enough to drive someone to insanity.
Well, I don't think so. Raymond, he ran a company called Fonar, which ended up suing places like General Electric and Siemens for patent violation because he had patented the relaxation effect. And he got millions of dollars for Fonar through his patents. And that's one of the reasons people didn't like him. And then there's speculation, that, I went to Fonar and Raymond was a very religious person. And they at Fonar, you started the day with prayer. When I went to Fonar, that's how it started.
I imagine they weren't doing that at GE.
Pardon?
I imagine they weren't starting the day with prayer at GE.
Probably not, but I think Raymond was a very good man, and I think that it's a sad note in the history of science that he didn't share it, especially that there was room for 3. And so,
and what did Lauterbur add to the mix?
How did Paul Lauterbur add to the mix? Sure. So Raymond had an idea of getting a signal by changing the position of the patient in the magnetic field. So he thought, well, there'll be just a little small sweet spot of the magnetic field, and by moving the patient around the sweet spot of the magnetic field, we'll get an image. Well, nobody does it that way. That's not how it's done. So you have a very homogeneous magnetic field. So you want to place the body in a big magnet, and the field is very homogeneous over 40 centimeters or so, 40 centimeter sphere. It's quite homogeneous. And then what you do is you superimpose gradient fields on top of that to get the inhomogeneity. So what Paul did was he used the gradient method. He imposed the gradient method for the first time. Well, actually, he was not, because Robert Gaillard was the first person. Robert Gaillard in France was the first person to propose this in 1952, and then he did that in his PhD thesis. But Paul it was probably unknown to Paul, and Paul did it at Stony Brook, and then he sent the paper, I think, to Nature, and then it was initially rejected, and then he fought with them to, hey, don't reject this paper, this is important, and eventually the paper went in.
So
And
he sort of added some functionality to the setup.
he added some functionality. The method was called projection reconstruction, and if you look at the paper, it's on a capillary, and there was something missing called slice selection. He didn't have the ability to select the slice. So he was actually imaging a capillary, and when you cut the capillary, no matter where you cut it, you get the same cut along the z-axis if you align the capillary with the z-axis. So he didn't have to select a slice, but in medicine, we actually have to select a slice. So people don't do projection reconstruction to get an MR image. And that's what, but what Paul did was he used the gradient to encode the spins. That was extremely important. That's how we do it. We have a readout gradient, and then we encode the spins, and that came from Paul. And then for Peter Mansfield, what he did was he utilized the echo. There's in MRI, there's something called an echo. We generate an echo, and that's extremely important. We phase encode, and we generate these echoes, and that came from Peter Mansfield. And Peter Mansfield was the first person he imaged the finger of, I think it was his postdoc, Maudsley, and that was the first human object imaged before animals were imaged. So and that was, I think it was 1976 where he imaged the finger of Andrew Maudsley. So and then Peter went on to do beautiful stuff in NMR. I mean, not just at the beginning, but then he also developed echoplanar imaging, and that was extremely important, using refocused echoes with the gradient. And that technique permits you to get an image of the head in just a few milliseconds. And so you can basically freeze motion with it. It's extremely important. So there are many things that Peter Mansfield did. So when you look at Nobel Prizes, it's not just one thing. There's a lot of what forces you have. What did you contribute overall to the field? And then, well, hopefully people will say, well, okay, this guy maybe should get a Nobel Prize. And unfortunately, not everybody could win. And I think it did hurt Raymond. I mean, he took out the ads and all that, but hopefully he got over it. And, people still know that he had a contribution. People who understand the field of magnetic resonance, they know that Raymond had a contribution. Maybe some people didn't care for him, but, science is not just about, I mean, a lot of people like to go out and have beer and make friends with scientists. And I never did that. When I go to national meetings, I went and I can't say I never did it, but I didn't pursue it. I went and read abstracts and studied, and and maybe I made a mistake not that many people in MRI would say, oh yeah, I was great friends with Pierre. People knew me, and I just did my work. And for instance, when the AT was built, and we had the first results at AT, the international meeting in MRI was in Australia that year. Well, most professors would say, oh gosh, I just had the world's first 8 Tesla images. I'm going to go present them in Australia. But I didn't. I stayed home and worked. And then my group went to Australia and presented the images because I felt it was too important and just stayed with the scanner.
Well, and of course, I guess it comes down to what your priority is, really. Like these folks,
right.
Like if you want to play that popularity contest, it might work out for your career in the short term, but
it also prevents you from making radical moves, right? Because
you're held in place.
Yeah, you get held in place by your societal forces, right? But for me, I never permitted that, and it's harmed me. That's fine. I mean, on a personal level, it harmed me in terms of salaries and friendships and all that. But on a scientific level, it was completely fine because it allowed me to go into other areas as I wanted and discover things that I would have not discovered otherwise. So, it's a way you look at science, right? So, like, some people are conforming and some people are they won't conform. So I was never a conformist. So when I told you the thing about the assistant professor, I never played that game. I didn't care if I got tenured or not.
I see.
I didn't care. You don't want to tenure me? I'll go do something else, And then same with becoming a full professor, I really didn't care. I was just going to do my job and do imaging. And if I don't get tenured, if I don't make distinguished professors or have a big group, it doesn't matter. I've been blessed in life with a great wife and a beautiful family. So,
well, this is one thing we talk about a lot, that science gives you the opportunity to do something that's part of a project that spans much more than your lifetime if you want it to. Like,
right.
It's really a human project. It's a species level project.
And science isn't done by one person sitting in a room. It's on the shoulders of giants. You tell this story of the progression from EPR to NMR to MRI. And that story is all about a project that is decades in the making, many careers, multiple generations.
Right. And so you look at, it continues, like if we continue to the road to ultra high field MRI, so that didn't happen in a vacuum, right? So before me, I mentioned the 4 Tesla there was a 4.1 Tesla in Alabama, and then NIH ended up getting Robert Balaban at NIH. I got General Electric had a 4 Tesla project, and they basically gave it to NIH. It was just, I think it was in Schenectady, and I think they just wanted to get rid of it because it was more than they wanted, I think.
So why the obsession with strength? What does strength give you?
The higher the field strength, the better the images get. But you have susceptibility issues as well, but you get more signal to noise, so you do get better images. So what happened was people were pushing to go to higher fields, 4 Tesla, and there were 4 4 Tesla systems in the world. And I mentioned Bob Balaban at NIH with General Electric, and then Camille Ugerville, who I talked to about before, he had the first Siemens 4 Tesla at Minnesota, and that scanner was just phenomenal. He did some beautiful functional imaging work on that 4 Tesla, and he showed that bolt contrast, which is the contrast we use in functional imaging, it gets better. If you're at lower field, you're looking at larger vessels. You're looking at capillaries; they're pretty large. But if you go to higher fields, you look at smaller and smaller structures. So the effects of smaller structures. So the bold contrast that you see at 1.5 is not the same that you see at 4 Tesla, and Camille showed that. So that was extremely important. He was doing just phenomenal work.
And this gives you more diagnostic power?
It gave you the better result, actually. It was not just diagnostic power. You do functional imaging, you look at images, you activate, let's say you give light activation, and you can see the occipital lobe light up, and you'll see a different result at 1.5 and 4 Tesla. So Camille really pushed that, and he did wonderful work with that. So Camille had done some beautiful work at 4T, and then there was also sorrow at 4T. Like Columbia had a 4T magnet. It was one of the first 4T magnets, but not much ever came out of the Columbia magnet. So,
and that's because they weren't looking at interesting things, or?
No, just the technology was so hard. So what happened was, before the 8 Tesla was built, people were very leery about going to higher fields, because the 4 Tesla scanners they were difficult to operate, and there was a lot of lack of success. So Paul Lauterbur, who we talked about, Paul, he had won the Nobel Prize, right? And he tried to get a 4 Tesla in Illinois, and millions of dollars were spent on it, and the magnet never came to field, and they never got a 4 Tesla to Illinois.
So it was very risky.
It was very risky. And so the magnets were expensive to build, and there was a lot of money involved, and so there were really only 4 Tesla sites when I built the 8 Tesla. But before that, there was something very important that happened, and that was at 3 Tesla. There was a guy called Joe Helper. He was at Henry Ford Hospital, and Joe, he ended up getting a 3 Tesla. Now, the reason that was important is because that magnet was built by a very small company in England called Magnetic Scientific. So that was their first magnet that they had built a human magnet big enough to put a human, like they built NMR scanners, small bores, you know, you can only put small samples in it. They had done those, but they had never built something like a 3 Tesla human magnet. So Magnex built that 3 Tesla for Joe Helfer. And when I decided to get the 8 Tesla, it was Magnex that I went after. So I went to Oxford because Oxford Instruments in Oxford, there's a company called Oxford Instruments, and they were building magnets. So I could buy the magnet from them, or I could go to this new startup place called Magnex Scientific, which is a very small enterprise, and it was run by this great guy called David Rayner. He was the president, and I really loved. I love Dave Rayner. He was just a very decent human being. Yeah, he's still alive, but he retired. I pray he's still alive, but he's retired. But anyhow, he left Magnex. Eventually, it was sold. But
so you were making lots of friends, just not necessarily at the science
he was
conference.
an industrial friend. But I don't know if he was a friend. I mean, I met him and we negotiated the 8 Tesla together. And so that was kind of an interesting point because people had said, well, look, 4 Teslas are having a hard time. What are you thinking about going to 8 Tesla? And I gave a lecture at Harvard. It was about, this is before the Tesla. I was just telling them I'm going to build an 8 Tesla. And people were saying, well, Pierre, you should build a 6 Tesla first. Why are you building an 8? And I said, well, it's like a Lamborghini, you know, if you go 200 miles an hour, but you don't have to drive at 200. You know, you could go 55. So somewhere between 4 and 8 Tesla, there's a field that works. And I said, I can hit every one of them. So if 6 is the field, the highest field that you can do for human imaging, we'll go to 6. And if we could go to 8, we will. So what happened was now Magnex was a very small company, okay? They had never built such a magnet. They didn't even have a winding machine. You got to wind these magnets on these big winding machines. They didn't even have one that could wind an 8 Tesla magnet. They didn't have a machine that big. Actually, after I ordered the magnet, they ordered a winding machine from Portugal, and then there was a French trucker strike, and we couldn't get the winding machine to the UK so that we could start winding the magnets. But anyhow, so what happened with Dave, remember what I was telling you about Dr. Zavoisky said, well, Pierre, you can have so much money and you can buy whatever you want. Mm-hmm. So I had found out that the cost of the conductor, which is the key part of building the magnet, was about 1,000 pounds per kilometer. And for a Tesla magnet, we needed 400 kilometers. Wow. Okay. So I had a very good idea of what their costs were. I had a very good idea of what it would cost Magnex to build an 8 Tesla magnet. But Magnex, typically when scientists bought magnets, now not for just always, when you buy a research magnet, you contract to a company, you say, okay, I'm buying a 9.4 Tesla magnet. Now, if that magnet only goes to 8 Tesla or 7 Tesla, well, you don't pay for it. You get a new one, right? Well, a small company like Magnex could not afford to do that. They can't afford to build an 8 Tesla magnet and take $1 million loss on it, right? Or more than $1 million. You got to get a winding machine, and there's a lot of, so they couldn't take a bloodbath on this thing. So what they did was they designed an 8 Tesla magnet. And then I decided to contract with them such that OSU would buy a 6 Tesla magnet for $1.3 million. I still remember this. $1.3 million, we buy a 6 Tesla magnet. But for every 10th of a Tesla, about 6 Tesla that they did, they get an extra
$25,000.
Okay. So it ended up costing $1.83 million by the time it went to 8 Tesla. Okay. So that was a way that Magnex could absorb their cost, because when the magnet first came to field in England, because you have to test the magnet before you ship it to make an MRI. So you build an MRI, you build a magnet first, and you put a bunch of stuff together with it to make an MRI scanner. The magnet's only one component, but it's the most important one. So what happened was they built the magnet and it gets tested in Oxford. And when it got tested, it quenched at 7.35 Tesla. So it never went to Tesla. When it reached 7.35 Tesla, it quenched. So what does that mean? So these are superconducting magnets, right? They run with helium. There's helium inside the magnet. And so what happens is that...
And that's to make them more conductive?
Yeah. So you cool the magnet. So you have a wire and it's superconductive. Okay. This is a niobium titanium wire. And so you have a channel, It's a U-shaped channel, and it's made out of copper. And inside that U-shaped channel, there's a wire running. Okay, and there's 400 kilometers of this wire running in a U-shaped copper channel. It's niobium tin, a niobium titanium. So what happens is that you then cool this. You wind the magnet, and then you put it in helium, and then you put current in it. So for an 8 Tesla magnet, you need 200 amps of current in that magnet to get it to 8 Tesla. It's got so many Henrys, and you put so much current in it, and you're going to get an 8 Tesla magnet out of it. But what happens? So when you have such a magnet, it has magnetic stored energy in it, and that magnet had 60 megajoules of stored magnetic energy. Well, if you know, I don't know if you're old enough, but when you did years ago, there was a pin drop commercial, you know, for telephone. They would you could hear a pin drop. So they would take a pin that people use for sewing, and they just drop it on the table. Well, that
like AT&T or something.
Yeah, so that had about 1 millijoule of energy in it, of kinetic energy, 1 millijoule. And if you take a locomotive that weighs 200 tons and you send it down the track at 60 miles an hour, it'll have about 60 megajoules of stored energy in it, the same as the magnet, right? But if the wire inside the magnet, you know, when you're putting the energy in the magnet, the wire is under enormous forces, and the wire wants to move. They want to move against each other.
And they have to be very carefully aligned in order to maintain the field.
Yeah, so if the wire moves, you can get a disturbance in the wire, and you'll get a disturbance on the order of a millijoule. And that's enough to send all the current out of the conductor, out of the superconductor, and into the copper. So now the current flows out of the conductor into the copper, and then it's quenched. So the magnet loses its field completely. Okay.
And then when you turn it off, it pops back into the original position, so it doesn't do it at a lower field strength.
So this is there's something interesting here about magnets. So what happens is so when the magnet went up to 7.35 Tesla, a wire moved and it quenched. Okay. So likely a wire moved and it quenched. So what happens is that's called a training quench. So then I said, okay, 7.35. I flew to England. I said, okay, it's at 7.35, good enough. So it had actually quenched at 7.37, and then they brought it. They called me up and said, Pierre, it quenched at 7.37. I said, okay, I'll come to England. We'll look at it. And so I said, bring it back. We'll bring it back up to 7.35, just under the quench point. So they brought it up to 7.35, and I flew to England and I accepted it. So then they shipped it to Columbus, and then these are called training quenches. This happens with magnets, you know. Once the wire moves, it's assumed that position, so it's not going to move again. It's already moved to the position you want it. So the next time when you re-energize it, you can reach a higher field. So that's what happened. So we quenched at 7.37, and then we re-brought it up to 7.35 for testing, and then we discharged it to 0, shipped it to the US, and then when it came to the US, then it was slowly brought up and it hit 8 Tesla. But once it hit 8 Tesla, so remember, that's the pin drop thing, you know. It doesn't take much to quench these magnets, right? And all this energy can be lost. But once they're stable, then they're stable. So anyhow, so what happened was that, so I had never done work, you know, I had done experimental work with animals, and taken images with animals and so on, but I had never done a human image other than 1.5 Tesla, which are clinical scanners. A clinical scanner, you just push the button, and GE's got it worked out for you. You hardly need to think. You just push the button, it'll collect an image. That's if you're not doing research, you know. They have a protocol, and you just push the button, and it'll go through and prepare itself and then take the images. So now there's more to it than that, but basically it's not too hard to get an image off a clinical scanner, but a research scanner is very different.
You basically have to program the whole thing yourself from scratch.
Well, there was some programming, and I have to say here that I was very blessed that I had one of my best postdocs who became a research scientist with me, Amir Abdul-Jalil. He's retired now. He lives in Orlando, but he was just a phenomenal human being, a great programmer. He trained in physics. at OSU, and then came and postdoc with me, and then we did a lot of things together, and then he went on to become the major programmer. Now we had bought so you get components, okay? You're building an IT scanner, and you're getting components. So we got the magnet from magnets, okay? And then, well, we need amplifiers, because now we're going to send radio energy into this thing. And people have said it's going to take you a lot of energy, Pierre, to collect this image. And as a matter of fact, people thought you would cook the person that went in, you could cook their brain, right? So, because so much microwave energy, or not microwave, ultra high field energy is going to go into the head, you could have localized heating and you could hurt the person, right? So somebody had to be first, and that was me. I was the first person to be imaged at ultra high field on my head. And, when I went into the magnet, I realized, okay, I might not come out of here with the cerebellum. I have no idea. But
did you make a back of the envelope calculation that you were confident that it was going to be okay?
Phantoms, and of course we were careful. And I mean, I didn't tell him put 10 kilowatts into my head. I started at the bottom and try to hit the 90, and we got a reasonable number. But still, somebody had to be the first person to do that. And when you don't know if it's going to work, and you have a wife and children, and now you're going to put your head in an ultra high field scanner and get the first image ever in the world. I love science, and I showed it in many ways. So, I risked my life for ultra high field, and that's a reality. But anyhow, so now getting back to we were talking about. So I had never collected an image. At 4 Tesla, I mean, all these 4 Tesla scanners, and some of them were having a hard time, like Columbia was having a hard time. And, there were some successes, but also some difficulties at 4 Tesla. There were only 4 scanners, and it wasn't going that well. So what I decided to do was, when the scanner hit the 8 Tesla, I said, okay, we're done 8 Tesla now. We're not going to collect an image. We're going to bring the magnet back down to 4.7. So because 4 Tesla was the world record. So if I go to 4.7, that's 200 megahertz. So that'll be a new world record in imaging. So let me get my 4.7 Tesla images first. So that's what I did. I brought down the scanner, and we immediately, the magnet arrived. It arrived on Christmas Eve of 1997. Okay, Christmas Eve of 1997. That's when it entered the room at Ohio State. I was thinking, what a Christmas present, right? You get an ultra high field magnet for Christmas. And so anyhow, so it had arrived, and people thought it would take us years, 2-3 years to get the first image. Well, within a few months, not even 6 weeks, I think, from the time the magnet came to OSU, so we got the first image at 4.7 Tesla, might have been 2 months at most.
Wow. And that's a testament to your team, right? Because that's a group of people.
Yeah, I was very fortunate, Now, OSU is a little bit unusual, because most places that have high field magnets, there's a lot of professors trained in MRI in those places. But OSU, I was the only.
You were it.
I was trained in MRI, and the people working on the AT had all been trained by me. So they were my postdocs or my graduate students that I had trained in MR.
So there wasn't much politics that you had to navigate with a bunch of big fish. It was sort of, you had defined the culture at the university when it came to this. And so that must have contributed somewhat to the ability of people to work easily.
I don't know. For whatever it is, the people that worked on the AT had been trained by me. Now we had some people that came from the outside that had experienced. For instance, I got some help from GE. GE gave us surplus stuff like cables and stuff like that. So the GE gave us some surplus equipment from old scanners that they had taken off these cables, and they're going to be shredded. And I said, please don't shred them, just give it to us, and we'll use them for these Tesla. So they gave us gradient cables and so on. And then gradient amplifiers, we got our gradient amplifiers, and it was there were people at Techron, that was a gradient amplifier manufacturer, and Ken Bradshaw was there, and Ken helped us, to provide to us gradient amplifiers. And so there's some people that were involved that weren't trained by me, but they were, like, for instance, CPC built our amplifiers, our RF amplifiers, and that was a new company too. And CPC, you can look them up. CPC amplifiers today, they're a big place, but back then they had never built an amplifier that could deliver so much power at 340 megahertz. So that's another thing that we negotiated to get the first RF amplifiers that could provide a large amount of power for an ultra high field scanner. So anyhow, but in terms of the people who actually collected the images and assembled things for the magnet, it was pretty much my group. There was one person that had 4 Tesla experience that he had worked, I think, in the Navy. His name was Paul Noah, and Paul had helped Alabama with their front end and their TR switches, transmit receive switches, and Paul helped us on this part of the TR switches. And so we were blessed. I mean, the parts that needed to fit, you know, what OSU didn't have, Paul gave us. I can give Paul some thanks for helping us with the front end. But of course, you know, such scanners, they involve so much complexity, right? Mm-hmm. And what happens is you have to be very familiar with the engineering of lower scanners before you can go up to something like 4 Tesla. So after I became a professor, you know, I just went into hardware very hard, and I building coils, and I spent a lot of time working on coil technology for our research projects, not for the 8 Tesla, for other magnets, and developed coil technology, and, you know, replicated what I knew existed in other places. Okay, I'm going to build this too. So that was one thing I did a lot of, is hands-on work building RF coils, and that was very important. It became very important for the 8 Tesla that I had that experience, even though OSU had a very powerful group in electrosciences that could calculate coils, and they were building coils in microwave, and they ended up helping us theoretically, but that was the fruits of that came after the 8 Tesla had already acquired the first image. So the first image, we didn't really get contributions from electroscience that they helped us, but later on there were contributions that were made there. So you know, I had lots of, it was the right place at the right time. I remember when I came to OSU, they said, well, you know, Pierre, OSU, it's a phenomenal university. It's like a supermarket, you know, we have everything. and they do. OSU is a supermarket. They have it. So anyhow, so after we went to 4.7 Tesla, then we got the first 4.7 Tesla images, and we had them. And so then I said, okay, well, let's move on to the next. Let's go up to 8 Tesla. So we went up to 8 Tesla, and I remember this. I told Amir, which I just mentioned to you. I said, Amir, I'm too tired this weekend. The magnet was ready to image a 4.7 at 8 Tesla. And I said, I'm just burnt out. My wife and I are going camping this weekend, and I just need a break. I said, we'll start Monday. So while I was gone, so Patty and I went camping with our children. And then while I was gone, Amir put a sample in there. Just he took a coil, and he put a ball that contained mineral oil, and he tried to get to 90. Now this is a measure of how much power it takes to get an image. And when I came back on Monday, he says, "Oh, Pierre, it's a disaster." He says, "I couldn't find the 90. It's way high." So he had started like at a. So I guess I should go back. You know, when these first 4 Tesla scanners were going, you know, it was known that power was moving with the square of the field in MRI on these scanners. And so for those who know some physics, you know, the square of the power increasing with the square of the frequency, that's called the ultraviolet catastrophe. You know, it's a disaster in thermal radiation. The power cannot keep increasing forever.
The law doesn't actually hold in that nice simple fashion.
It doesn't hold. So eventually power has to break. So the question is, well, where is it going to break? And the 4 Tesla scanners were using a lot of power. And so when I built the 8 Tesla, people were saying, well, Pierre, you're going to fry people's brains. And even the chairman of radiology wrote, Dr. Healy was the dean of the College of Medicine at that time. Dr. Zhurnal had retired, and Dr. Healy, she ended up eventually leading the Red Cross in the United States, but she was the dean of the College of Medicine. And my chairman actually wrote her a letter that, this scanner might require so much power, people are going to fry their brains in there. It's going to be dangerous. So I went to Dr. Healy. I said, look, just be reassured. I mean, we're not going to just take patients and put them in there. We're going to know if we're going to be careful. So there was a risk. Now, there's a very important MRI scientist in Berkeley. I think he's retired now, Tom Budinger. And Tom had a dream of building the world's first 10 Tesla scanner years ago. I think it might even be before the 4 Teslas were there. I don't know exactly the time frame, but I know that it was Tom. And he had this dream of building a 10 Tesla scanner. And they had a committee that came apparently and told him, well, it'll require so much power to get an image of 10 Tesla, you just kill people. You're going to fry their heads. And then that the project would be so expensive, it would take an act of Congress just to get the money to do it. So the 10 Tesla scanner just died. Okay. So that was about the time that 4 Teslas were just coming of age. So Tom, even though he was a good scientist, he never got his 10 Tesla, even though he might have made something of it if he had the chance to a 10 Tesla. But unfortunately, it never came for him. So anyhow, we ended up having this risk of how much power is it going to take to get an image. So Amir had tried to get the image, and then I know the date. It was the 25th of March of 1998, and he didn't get an image, and from a phantom, not from a human. And so then when I came into work on Monday, he said, "Oh, Pierre, it's a disaster." And well, what's wrong with me? He says, "It's just taking so much power, Pierre. We'll never get an image of it." So I said, "Well, okay, let's go back and we'll just don't." I said, "Where did you start?" He said, "Well, I started at a kilowatt because people had told us what's moving the square of the field. So it started at a kilowatt and just go up." And so he started at a kilowatt and went up. And I said, "Well, let's just start at 0 and work our way up." And let's not start at a kilowatt. But when we got to 90 watts, it mutated the spins and we had the image. I'm like, oh my gosh, the power is not what I expected. And so then at 4.7 Tesla, it had taken us 330 watts for a 4 millisecond sync pulse to mutate the spins to get a 90 at 4.7 Tesla. And at 8 Tesla, it ended up taking 100 watts for a 4 millisecond sync. So there was some big change there. And wow, what did this mean? I mean, why is it that the power was not what we had expected? So anyhow, so then we discovered in the phantom that the power was not, it wasn't going to move with the square of the field. And then eventually, people are still arguing about this. To me, it's kind of, people were saying these scanners would never exist. You'd never build a 10 Tesla. Right now, if you look around the world, after we'll go back a little bit. So we had the 8 Tesla and we got these beautiful images. And so here, I don't know if you could read this.
The Journal of Computer Assisted Tomography.
Yes, and so this was the 1999 issue of December 1999. And after we got the first 8 Tesla images, Alvin Elster, who was the editor of this journal, I sent him a paper and he says, "Pierre, I will take all the 8 Tesla images you can send me." And so this is like an 8 Tesla image. I don't know if you guys can see it, but they were just beautiful, beautiful. So he in this issue, he published 10 8 Tesla papers back to back in a single issue of the Journal of Computer Assisted Tomography. Now, these weren't the first image. The first image actually went to NMR and Biomedicine, which was a very small journal. So I didn't send it to Nature or Science. I sent it to a paper, to a journal that was like a third-tier journal in magnetic resonance. I didn't care. I just wanted the image published. I don't want to argue with you guys about it. And when the review came back on the first paper, they wanted me to remove the last paragraph. I said, look, either the last paragraph stays in, you get the paper, or if you want me to take the last paragraph out, I'm going to submit somewhere else. So they took the last paragraph and it was submitted, and it went to NMR in biomedicine.
What did
What
the
was
last
the last
paragraph
paragraph?
say? Yeah.
The last paragraph talks about NMR as a thermal process. So,
And so this
so
leads
that-
us
This is a
neatly.
theoretical
Yeah.
advancement.
yeah. So we had these 10 papers in the Journal of Computer Tomography back to back. And then back in those days, so now we're in 1999. So we're collecting images and stuff, and now the papers are being submitted, and we had like 20 or 30 papers at AT before the first 7 Tesla papers ever came out. So, and one of the things we showed is the phenomenal signal to noise. So at first I thought the scanner there's something wrong with the signal to noise, it's too low. And I won't tell you what happened because there was something that happened there, and it would not reflect good on others. So I won't discuss why it was that the signal to noise was too low, because eventually I found out what it was, and we corrected it and fixed it. And people don't need to know. We know that the signal to noise was high. And so what happened was, back in those days, there was the 2K fear, So Y2K, the year 2000 was coming, and then we're going to have Y2K, and the world was going to stop rotating. So what happened was I decided to collect the world's first very high resolution images of the head. And so I called the paper 2K by 2K for Y2K. So a high resolution image in MR used to be a 512 by 512, okay? 512 pixels by 512. And for this paper, I did 2000 pixels by 2000. And these are some of the images. And when people saw these images, they are still very close to the world record today. I mean, they might not be the world record right now, but they have such high resolution. They're still 20 years later very close to the world record for resolution in MRI. So that paper was called 2K by 2K for Y2K, and so that was the January-February issue of JCAT, and Dr. Elster, who really fought to defend me. And I owe him a great deal because he wanted people to know that Pierre had done ultra-high field. And that was the reason that he took all these papers. But he wrote in this thing, and I just want to read it because it's so beautiful what he said. He said, Pierre-Marie Robitaille and Ohio State University MRI have done it again. In this issue, they present the world's first MRI images obtained at 2000 by 2000 resolution in honor of the new millennium, of course. In case you miss it, check out the JCAT issue for November, December. Here, Robitaille and his colleagues has published 10 landmark articles describing the design and construction of their 8 Tesla whole body MRI scanner. So, and as well as additional remarkable images of the brain. If you wish to download some of these images directly, they're available on our website, Happy Y2K from JCAT. So Alan Elster was a super nice guy. He's a radiologist, but I think he did a master's in mathematics at Oxford, I think. But anyhow, this is a nice guy. So we got some beautiful images, and then eventually in 2006, I would publish this book, Ultra-High Field Magnetic Resonance Imaging, and it contained contributions of basically of the world leaders in high field MR, all pretty much contributed to that book in 2006. So, it was an enormous success story. And since that time, now they're probably there's well over 57 Tesla magnets in the world now. And ultra high field magnets, there's well over 50 of them. And
did you ever think of trying to push it even further? Did you ever want to build another?
Well, people have tried to push it further. So in Germany, at the Erwin Hahn Institute, they have a 7 Tesla magnet with 32 channel parallel transmit systems for whole body imaging. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, you see the images off that scanner, and you're just like, wow. So there was something that happened with 8 Tesla. So, and this is part of not being confined by societal norms, right? I didn't care what people thought. Okay, you like me, you don't like me, it's completely irrelevant. But what had happened is, when the 4 Teslas were having difficulty, people came to the conclusion that only the best groups in the world can do high field. Only this is reserved for the for the stellar few, okay? And then Robitaille comes along, he's a nobody. He builds an 8 Tesla and he gets these magnificent images. Well, that actually transformed the field because people started thinking, hey, we can do it too. If Robitaille can do it, why can't we do it? I mean, so it broke the barrier of 4 Tesla. And not only did it do that for the 7 Tesla magnets, but clinically, people started pushing the 3 Tesla scanners, which have become commonplace now. Used to be 1.5 Tesla. Now, if you need imaging, people will say, okay, well, let's get a 3 Tesla image for him because you're going to get a better image. So 8 Tesla really pushed the whole field forward, not just, in the sense of just the ultra high field scanners, but all of magnetic resonance saw the benefit of going to higher and higher fields. So, and then, of course, after the 8 Tesla and the success of the 7 Teslas, which they're uncountable now. I don't know how many there are. There are more than 50, but and they're all over the world. Now, can you imagine that? Never happened with the 4 Teslas. There are not a bunch of 4 Teslas all over the world. There are those 4 Teslas that were at these few universities, but after that, people went either to 3T or they went to 7T. The 4 Teslas, yeah. So they went to 7T, and so I had an 8 Tesla magnet because I wanted the field. So that magnet's only 80 centimeters in size. I have to have special gradients for that magnet. But clinical magnets are 90 centimeters in diameter and size. The clinical magnet is 90 centimeters. So the 7 Tesla magnets, you say, well, why aren't there a whole bunch of 8 Tesla magnets? It's because the 7 Tesla magnets have a bigger bore inside. You can make the bore bigger, so they're 90 centimeters. So they fit a standard gradient coil from the manufacturer, whereas the 8 Tesla was a little bit smaller at 80, and so it required a special gradient. So that's one of the reasons that 7 Teslas took off, and there was a 7 Tesla eventually at the University of Minnesota about 2 years after the 8 Tesla at Ugerbill again, who had done beautiful work. Remember, I trained with him, and then he did beautiful work at 14, and then he got a 7 Tesla, and then there was a 7 Tesla with Bruce Rosen at NGH, and then Alan Koretsky at NIH got a 7 Tesla too. So 7 Tesla started really proliferating. These were the early ones with Rosen and Koretsky and Ugerbill. And then after that, Keith Thalburn, who's at the University of Illinois, he got one of the world's first 9.4 Teslas, and he did wonderful work on sodium and potassium. And then eventually Ugerbill went even further. He got a 9.4 Tesla, and then Camille went even further. Now he's got a 10.5 Tesla. But the new record is an 11.7 90 centimeter magnet. I think it's a new record now. 11.7. It's built by GE, and it reached field in 2019. Now, surprisingly, that magnet is not too different than the Tesla. It's different in one thing. So it has almost the same number. Like, for instance, there's an 11.7 Tesla supposedly in Korea. It's a 68 centimeter coil, and it's 68 centimeters inside, and it also has 400 kilometers of wire, just like the. And so, how are they reaching 11.7 Tesla? Well, what they do is they lower the temperature of the magnet. So there's something called the critical temperature in a superconductor, and when you lower the temperature of the magnet, so instead of being at 4 Kelvin, now lower the temperature. You can pump on the helium and make the temperature go down. So for the 11.7 90 in Paris, that operates at 1.8 Kelvin. So lower than 4 Kelvin. So at a lower temperature, the conductor, the same conductor, niobium titanium, can carry more current. So the question is, well, are we going to go to beyond 11.7 Tesla? Well, the answer is that's not easy. So 11.7, what happens at 11.7 is, so you wind this magnet, but when you wind an 11 with niobium titanium, you can just wind, it's a wire, and you just wind it on a bobbin, and it's no problem, and then after that, you'll energize it. But the next conductor, if you want to reach higher field, you need niobium tin. Well, that's a different monster, because niobium tin is so brittle, you can't wind it. What you do is you wind niobium and titanium filaments. They're next to each other, but they're not niobium titanium.
Niobium tin or niobium titanium?
Niobium tin. So you wind the niobium and the tin. Thanks for correcting me. You wind the niobium and the tin together. The filaments are running together, okay? Kind of like a multi-strand thing. Some strands are niobium and some strands are tin. And then those are wound onto the magnet, okay? So now you'll wind your 400 kilometers or whatever. Now you're trying to reach 20 Tesla. You change conductor. But the thing is, niobium tin, niobium tin is very fragile. So you can't wind it already made. So you wind fibers that contain niobium and tin. And then after you've wound the magnet, you pot the magnet, you cook it. And when you heat it, then the wires melt together and that makes your niobium tin.
Wow.
Okay. So these magnets are very brittle, and now people are starting to talk about, well, look, we're going to try to go to 20 Tesla. You know, there's some talk in the world right now. Some people want to go to 20 Tesla. Now, I don't know if that's actually a good idea. Higher fields, I mean, you know, there are some effects. I mean, people have seen, like in frog embryos, that the planes of division in the embryo change in very, very high magnetic fields. So there are things. So I don't know. I mean, it's not for me. I mean, I think once you reach 7 Tesla and maybe 11.7, that's already pretty good. So I don't know if how far it'll go, but I don't want to be pessimistic too. You know, I don't want to be the guy that said there'll be no more patents after 1880. You know, it might be a 20 Tesla someday. So I don't want to discourage anybody. You know,
the future is not yet set.
Yeah.
Well,
so anyhow, that's a little bit about MRI, and you know, and I thought I'd spend my whole life doing MRI, right? That I would just. I mean, I had built the world's first ultra high field scanner. I had the world's best images, and the OSU had given me such a privileged position to lead that effort. So, you know, I thought I'd be doing MRI all my life, but then, you know, this whole question of power, the RF power, the amount of power that it took to get an image, it just started bothering me, and I started thinking about, well, you know, gosh, Bloch, Felix Bloch, a long time ago, he told us MRI was a thermal process, but nobody thinks about MRI that way. If you talk to MRI scientists, and what processes in MRI are thermal? I mean, most of them won't be able to answer the question, or they don't even think about it, because you know, what does it mean that MRI is a thermal process? You know, people don't want to think about that, and because, well, why bother with it? I mean, I remember when I got the first AT images, people said, well, Pierre, you've got AT images. Why do you care about thermal physics? Why do you care about it? And I said, well, there's something very important going on here, and we need to understand it. So that's why I care. So yeah,
and getting interested in the thermal process of MRI led you to get interested in the sort of other fields of physics.
Right. So MRI is a thermal process. So we're sending RF energy into our sample. We're sending watts, and we're receiving a small signal back, right? But let's say that the person was not in the magnet. You know, when you just put an RF coil on their head and we send watts to them, well, we won't get an MRI image, but we can cook their brain, right? I mean, if we send enough power, so the government regulates that. I mean, the Food and Drug Administration regulates that. So when the AT was built, you know, we had an investigational device exemption from the FDA. So when you do this kind of research, you know, they don't just let these scientists do whatever they want. The federal government is controlling this very carefully. You have to, because you don't want to injure people, right? And so we had a Food and Drug Administration investigational device exemption, and the AT actually gave birth to all the 7Ts, because when the Food and Drug Administration upped the regulations for imaging humans, they based it on the AT results. So people, you could image up to 8T, you know, became, okay, that's acceptable. You can do this up to 8 Tesla. So 8 Tesla kind of became a ceiling, and now the ceiling will move again. But I think currently it might still be a Tesla, and that's because of our scanner, because it was OSU, it was the only scanner that had that.
So there was sort of this background acknowledgement that there was a thermal process occurring, but it wasn't centered in the discussion.
Right, it wasn't central. But for me, I started thinking about it, and Felix Bloch had called the T1. So we have two relaxation processes going on in MRI. One is called T1 relaxation, and the other one is called T2. And the T1 relaxation, that's an interaction between the spin and the lattice that it's sitting in. So you have a vibrational lattice, and the spin is interacting with that lattice. And Felix Bloch called that the thermal relaxation constant. Now, if you talk to young MRI people, I mean, young trainees, they probably don't even know that T1s used to be called the thermal relaxation constant. I read a lot of the history of science, so I'm well aware of what the first paper said, and that's what Felix wrote in this paper, that you know, MRI is a thermal process. So
I think this would be a wonderful place to start another conversation very soon.
Yes, because now that kind of throws me into, well, how did Pierre ever get messed up with astronomy? And when he's doing, you know, wonderful things in MRI and having such, you know, beautiful images and so on, now there are a lot of forces in my life that caused me to go towards it. One of them was the science. There was powerful scientific forces that sent me that way towards astronomy. And then there were also the reality of, okay, AT is here, and you know what? Other people will make this work now. This threshold has been broken, and now 7Ts are appearing, and you know, it's okay, you know.
You needed a new challenge.
Well, it's not just a new challenge, and there were personal forces in my life and a lot of things going on, and I decided, look, it's time to move and go after this, I consider an even bigger prize, and that's the sun and the microwave background problem. So I think these prizes, and I talk about them, you know, people think about Nobel Prizes as prizes. I'm glad people get Nobel Prizes. It's great, but the real prizes is just the joy of, you made the discovery, that's the prize, right? I mean, even if somebody gives you a medal, if you don't get to share in your heart that personal thrill that you made a wonderful discovery, that you were blessed to be the one that got to acquire these images, or got to see something about the sun that people didn't realize before. That's the real prize. That's why you do science, right? That's where the love of science comes in.
And that's the human project behind the whole thing that extends beyond one lifetime, which is really amazing.
Exactly. And people don't do science just because they can be rewarded someday with a prize, right? Most scientists, they know there's just a few people are going to get these prizes. A lot of people are working in the laboratories and making big discoveries. They might never get a prize. But why do they go to work? They don't go to work because, okay, I'm going to get a prize someday. They go to work because they love science. And they have that thrill of learning new things, you know? That's a beautiful thing about science.
And so perhaps...
anyhow, well, thanks.
Yeah. Perhaps we can start at this point the next conversation that we have, which is the direction that you went after 8T.
Yes. Yeah, the direction I went, how did this guy go off his rocker and move out of the 8T into astronomy? How did that ever happen? So
I would put it more, how did the scientist bridge the gap between these two fields? And I think that there's a lot there to uncover, but I want to make sure that we can do it justice.
All right. Well, thanks for interviewing me, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Dr. Robitaille.
It was our pleasure. Thank you, Dr.
Let's
Robitaille.
talk again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.